Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this discussion between myself, Matt Goodwin, and Liam Halligan. Many of you will know Liam from his excellent writing with The Telegraph, his work on Planet Normal. Some of you, I suspect, will also know him from his involvement with GB News. I've known Liam a long time, and more importantly, for today's discussion, I've long considered him to be well ahead of the curve on a lot of the big economic issues facing UK PLC, as well as the housing crisis, but we might come back and talk about that after the economy. This discussion follows an event that we had a few days ago, where I basically put out this question: is Britain about to blow? Is it about to blow economically? Is it about to blow socially, politically? Not only the warning signs flashing red on the dashboard when it comes to the economy, and Liam's going to talk to us about that, but we've also got, public protests up and down the country. We've got reform leading the national polls. We've got Jeremy Corbyn coming back in with a new party. We've got a social fabric that feels very febrile and fragile, and it just feels as though we are rapidly approaching some kind of crisis point. Now, Liam Halligan's been writing extensively about why he thinks the economy is actually a lot weaker than perhaps a lot of people in Westminster even think it is now. So I just wanted to have Liam on just so he could set out his stall, his thesis. He's also just joined Substack, by the way, or has joined Substack recently. So I'd urge you to go and find that. I believe the Substack, Liam, is called "When Facts Change."
When the facts change, it's a phrase by the economist John
Yeah.
Maynard Keynes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe Keir Starmer could do with listening to that. When the facts change. Yeah,
When the
I've changed
facts
my
change, you change your mind.
Absolutely. So, Liam, let's jump straight in. I've talked a little bit over the last few days about some of the macro points about the economy, the amount of debt, the shocking lack of growth. But just if you can, lay out your core thesis, your core argument about what is going on in UK PLC.
Thanks a lot, Matt. It's good to be with you today, and congratulations on building yourself an independent media platform, branching out from your work in academia. In many ways, we're quite similar in our backgrounds. I was very much an academic before I became a journalist. I think I'm one of the few people writing in the newspapers about economics who's actually been a professional economist. I've worked in financial services and so on. Though these days, most of what I do is journalism, of course. And look, I don't want to become a sort of sandwich board man, selling doom. I think very carefully before I write what I write, not only on my Substack When the Facts Change, but particularly in The Telegraph. I've been writing a column in The Telegraph every week, Economic Agenda, for 25 years, quite a long time. And that's a real responsibility. You have a duty to be not alarmist, to not spread concern where in order for clicks, if you like. That's not what I do. I'm not that kind of writer. But I am really very, very concerned by the lack of economic literacy now among our political and media class, the lack of financial literacy, and the fact that the trajectory we are on in terms of our fiscal policy, that is tax and spend, bears very, very close relation to what was going on in the run-up to 1976. Now, some older viewers and listeners will remember 1976 was the long, hot summer. Southampton won the cup against the mighty Man United. But actually, for people like me, people interested in policy and economics, and anyone really with a memory of that time, it was when the UK defaulted. The UK had to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund. It was our economic Suez. Of course, we'd had the Suez crisis under Eden in the early 60s, where Britain's lack of massive power on the global stage had been revealed. And 1976 was our economic Suez. It's when we really stopped being seen as a world-class international economy that could manage itself in a way that the rest of the world would revere. And we had to be bailed out by the International Monetary Fund. And that is the way we are heading now. Why do I think that, Matt? I think that because we have a national debt that's approaching 100% of GDP. That's just a headline number. But if you include off-balance sheet liabilities and the British state with our smoothie pants civil servants and our it will be fine old boy attitudes in many parts of our public sector, I'm afraid, we are masters at hiding fiscal liabilities off balance sheet. There's something, there's a sort of Bank of England scheme where they've played very fast and loose with fiscal concepts when they've been printing money or expanding the money supply virtually. They've been doing that since the global financial crisis. There's lots of financial and fiscal liabilities involved with that. There's the private finance initiative liabilities, which is when a scheme the Tories started in the 90s that was massively expanded by Labour, basically using private sector balance sheets to fund public sector infrastructure, and then you have to pay the private sector, many multiples more of what the infrastructure costs for the infrastructure and services over many decades. Hence, massive liabilities there. Above all, public sector pensions, that is pensions for civil servants, police, nurses, firefighters and so on. No one begrudges people working in our public services a decent pension, but these pensions are index linked in many cases. They're final salary pension schemes, pretty much the kind of schemes that have just disappeared from the private sector completely. And above all, these schemes were designed when people, retired at 60 and then, they'd be lucky if they were still alive at 70, 75. Of course, now life expectancy is deep into the 80s. So they're absolutely bankrupting our state. And if you add up all those liabilities, our fiscal, our national debt isn't 100% of GDP. It's at least 160. And on some definitions, it's way into the 200s. And these are very bespoke academic definitions of financial liabilities. And guess what? How is this expressed? It's expressed, Matt, in what it costs the government to borrow. It's absolutely crucial that these metrics, government borrowing costs, are injected into the national debate with attitude. This is seen as, crazy, inane stuff that financiers go on about. The gilt yield. What does that even mean? Well, look, ordinary people can understand this because ordinary people will have credit cards, mortgages, car loans, and ordinary people out there, I think, understand it a lot better than a lot of our politicians, particularly those, I'm afraid to say, on the Labour backbenches, many of whom, I say this with no pleasure, as you know, I have many friends and colleagues right across the political spectrum, but a lot of today's Labour backbenchers are simply economically illiterate. If my conversations with them and my reading of what they've been saying in the House are anything to go by. So look, there's this concept called the gilt yield. It's nothing to do with being guilty. It's GILT. Gilt as in gold leaf, as in the UK government's debt certificates used to have literally a gold leaf edge. They were gilt edged because they were the best in the world, and the British Empire, as it was then, was always good for its money. So the world calls UK government borrowing costs the gilt yield. And indeed, that's a word that's used across the industrialised world now. And our 30-year gilt yield, Matt, what the government pays to borrow money for 30 years is now completely an outlier across the Western world. Let me explain. Every month, the government has liabilities, benefits, all the stuff that governments spend money on, and it gets tax revenues in. Last month, in June, the government borrowed £20.7 billion. That's in 1 month alone. That's a huge amount of money. That's the amount of money, roughly, that you get from 3p on income tax over a whole year. It's a huge amount of money. That is added to the national debt. And
I think I'm right in saying that's the third highest since 97, or the second highest since 97.
It's the highest June since COVID. It's the highest June since June 2020, when the government completely locked down the economy, so there's very little tax revenue, and the government was throwing money out the door on furlough and very dubious business loan schemes. So even in June 2021, when we were still pretty locked down, we borrowed less. So it's 20.7 billion. It's 6.6 billion more than June 2024. But here is the clincher. of that 20.7 billion, right?
Yeah.
16.1 billion was spent on interest on existing debt. Absolutely mad. Yeah. Over 3/4 of the money the government is borrowing now is going on interest on existing debt.
So basically, we are borrowing 16. We borrowed 16 billion
Yep.
to pay the interest on our country's credit card.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, now many people will know, or they'll know of people. You got a massive credit card debt. You've been out, a bit handy with the shopping, and so you get another credit card to pay off that credit card debt, right? Now that's obviously an unsustainable thing to do. What we're doing is a lot worse than that. We're not getting another credit card to pay off the credit card debt and transferring it. We're getting another credit card to pay the interest on the existing credit card that still has massive debt on it. It's absolutely insane. And financial markets are noticing. And what do I mean by financial markets? You have pension funds, you have insurance companies, you have sovereign wealth funds, i.e. other governments, and they are very, very active in international capital markets, particularly what we call the sovereign bond markets. That is, the debt of governments. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with governments borrowing. Governments have borrowed, for centuries. Governments need to borrow from time to time to build infrastructure, to get, through difficult periods. But we've become totally addicted to borrowing. Yeah. We've only run a government surplus, that is, the government collecting more in tax revenue than it spends, twice in my lifetime, right? It's absolutely insane. And we haven't run a government surplus since 2001, by the way.
So when you say, Liam, just when you say the markets are noticing,
Yep.
They're noticing this massive pile of debt.
Yep.
They're noticing, the fact that, the cost of that debt is now very, very high. I think probably higher than it was at the point of Liz Truss.
I'll come on to that because
but certainly a bit higher. But aren't the markets also noticing the failure of the Labour government to reform the welfare state? Aren't they noticing the failure?
Matt, you're into politics, right? And economics. I'm into politics and economics. We like to think we're, it's what we do. We're pretty good at it. The guys who are, and girls who are investing in sovereign bonds, they leave us standing, right? It's absolutely what they do. They have the most incredible political intelligence. They talk to people like me all the time. They talk to all kinds of politicians. And that's not a bad thing. That's not corrupt. They're just trying to work out what's going on. And, when Rachel Reeves started crying in the House of Commons, the imputed increase in interest costs was in the billions. Because the markets thought, crikey, she's so frustrated. I mean, they see her as the standard bearer of fiscal prudence, and she's to the left of Gordon. Right? We'll come on to that. But just to spool back, so the British government is now over 3/4 of what it is borrowing, it is spending on debt interest, right? And that's up from about 2/3 last year. Last year, the British government borrowed £148 billion, right? Now, that's from April 24 to April 25. At the start of April 24, that's the beginning of that fiscal year, the OBR thought the British government was going to borrow about 80 billion.
Yeah.
So over the course of 1 year, between the forecast and the outcome, it went up from 80 to 148.
And that's partly because of what we're seeing with, public sector pay stuff.
When you give massive pay rises to your mates in the public sector, when, breakfast clubs and all the rest of it, massive ideological expansion of the state, it really costs a lot of money. And then at the same time, Matt, when you increase taxes, again for ideological reasons, throwing bones to your hard left MPs with your massive government majority, albeit on a very small share of the vote, as you and I have often said, when you raise those tax rates, like for national insurance on employers, capital gains tax rate went up, VAT on schools went up, the much more punitive tax regime for wealthy financiers who base themselves in the UK but have global business interests. All those things, while they please the Labour backbenchers and put tax rates up, they've led to less taxation, less
Yeah,
actual
absolutely.
revenue, less actual
So,
revenue.
so that brings me on to a question I wanted to ask you. So you've got, we've basically got flat growth. Labour's commitment to return us to a growth strategy is obviously failing. They've jacked up taxes on businesses through national insurance. That's basically removing any incentive for businesses to hire people, to grow. We remain fixed. I understand you might not agree with this point, but I would argue we also remain fixed to mass uncontrolled immigration, which is flooding the economy with cheap labour. So business, again, doesn't have much of an incentive to innovate, to become more dynamic. But here's my question. For the first time now, senior hedge fund guys, finance guys who know a lot more about this than I do, they're now saying we are at risk of entering a debt doom loop.
Yeah.
What do they mean by that? What is a debt doom loop?
Okay, hold that thought, right? Hold that thought. I said before that the British government, the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, estimated in April 24 that in that fiscal year, April 24 to April 25, the British government will borrow about 80 billion. It turned out to be 148 billion, right? Massive red flag. If within the same fiscal year your forecast is out by so much, massive red flag. Of that 148 billion the British government borrowed between April 24 and April 25, Matt, 105 billion of that was debt interest, right?
105 billion.
105 billion, so over 2/3. And now in the last month, as I illustrated earlier, we're at over 3/4 of the government money that you borrow being spent on debt interest. How much is 105 billion? What is this man going on about with all these numbers, right? Well, billion is 1 followed by 9 zeros, right? It's a lot of money. 105 billion, Matt, is getting on for double what we spend on defence each year. It's more than we spend on schools. So think of the morality of that. You know, many people on the left of politics will say, oh, you're so nasty, you go on about the public sector all the time. The morality of spending more on debt interest, more on facilitating our own fiscal incontinence, our inability to live within our means as our generation when we're in charge, more than we're spending equipping our young people for the future when they're going to have to pay off that debt.
And also, if I can just make one party political point on this, what frustrates me about, this wasn't just Labour. This is what
No.
folks in my community, what we would call the Uniparty, this was both Conservative and Labour governments presiding over this steady escalation of debt. And I remember the Tories in the 2010s saying specifically, don't worry about debt, don't worry, it's going to be fine. And then obviously as we went through COVID and the whole thing blew up and the cost of debt increased, well, now we're in this catastrophe. But here's just one party political point, if I may. A lot of folks in government are now saying every week to Nigel Farage and Reform, who are leading the polls, well, okay, you've got some ideas. How are you going to afford this? Where's the money? How are you going to afford this? Acting as though these guys have been fiscally competent. These guys have been economically prudent. And actually, if you look at how they've been running the UK economy over the last 15, 20 years, it's been fundamentally irresponsible. It's been completely amateurish. So when you're talking about these numbers, 105 billion pounds, I'm sort of thinking to myself, well, if we had less debt and we could bring in the price of that debt, if we could bring that down dramatically, and we could, what could you do to the NHS with 105 billion pounds? What could you do to schools? What could you do to
Transformative.
yeah, completely. So are you saying the 105 billion, this is what's pushing us nearer towards this debt doom loop?
Of course, and I'm building a picture to answer your question about what the hedge fund guys, the people who invest in government debt, they invest in government debt because that then gives them a regular income stream of interest payments, right? Which then pension funds use to meet their liabilities, payout policies, and insurance companies use to, you don't invest in government debt to make money, right? It's not, they're taking us to the cleaners and all this nonsense. You invest in government debt because you're required to by regulators to meet, to show that you can meet your future liabilities if you're a pension fund or an insurance company. And you invest in government debt if you're a sovereign wealth fund, a government investment fund, often from the so-called emerging markets, Middle Eastern governments and China, and the Russians have got a massive sovereign wealth fund. The Norwegians got. You invest in government debt because you're doing some rather more exotic investments on the side in infrastructure and other things that are risky, and you invest in government debt to balance your portfolio. So you have sort of low risk stuff and high risk stuff. It's a completely prudent thing to do. But people now investing in UK government debt, whisper it, they are really alarmed by what is happening because let me just lay out some more technical reasons, Matt, and you do your thing of coming in if you think I just need a little bit more explanation, right?
Yeah.
I talk to a broad audience all the time, as do you, but feel free just to pop in. But I'd like to try and get the sort of the factors which are alarming, right? So the first factor that's alarming about the UK is that we're spending, it was 2/3 in the last month, 3/4 of our government borrowing on debt interest, right? That is just unsustainable. Okay, that's mad. The second reason why people are alarmed about the UK is that you have these very big off-balance sheet liabilities that no one ever talks about, right? We spend endless nonsensical hours talking on television and the radio about Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules. Has she got 9 billion or 5 billion of headroom in 5 years' time? Utter nonsense. Utter displacement activity. When have you last heard by a mainstream broadcaster that the OBR said we were going to borrow 80 in 2024, 2025, and we borrowed 148, right?
Yeah.
It just blows the discussion of the fiscal rules is so people on telly can look clever. People who know nothing about fiscal policy and finance. It's just completely mad. And it's all about thinking if you can convince a bloke you're at university with who's in the OBR to change the forecast a bit, right? Then you've solved the problems. The markets don't believe that. They think that's the nonsensical parlour game, which it is. They're looking at realities, money in, money out. And at the moment, those realities are awful. So you've got the fact that we're spending so much money on debt interest. You've got those massive off-balance sheet liabilities, which people worry about. Third thing that's really worrying about the UK is what we call the headline gilt yield, right? The 30-year gilt yield. It's like the main benchmark, the 10-year and the 30-year. How much do you pay each year to borrow money for 10 years? How much do you pay each year to borrow money for 30 years? At the moment, the UK's 30-year gilt yield is the highest in the G7 by a long way. By a long way.
And is it higher than it was at the time of Truss?
At the peak, just momentarily, in the Liz Truss mini-budget crisis, we can come on to that, the 30-year gilt was 4.85, right? It's been above 5 for the whole of this year.
And yet the mainstream media hasn't had a meltdown.
The whole of this year.
Right.
Right? It's been higher. And now it's been touching 5.4, 5.5. And so that's why our interest bill is going up so much. I want to come back at some stage to talk about the Labour's inheritance, because it's not entirely fair to blame this on Labour, though they have made it a lot worse. And I will. But we're now paying 5.5 when we have a national debt of 100% of GDP. When Blair came in, the gilt yield wasn't much lower, but the national debt was 30% of GDP.
Of course,
It makes a huge difference when you're paying interest on a much smaller block of debt. So we've got the off-balance sheet liabilities. We've got the share of interest that is from our government borrowing. We've got the headline gilt yield rate. Our headline gilt yield is now higher, not just than France and the US. It's higher. It's obviously higher in Germany because they've got much lower debt. It's higher than Greece, Spain and Italy, considerably higher than Greece, Spain and Italy. So the high headline gilt yield. But the thing that's really spooking the market, and it's something that I've been writing about for some time, is that in order to try and keep our headline rates of debt interest, like the gilt yields, as low as possible, the British government, specifically the Debt Management Office, has been selling an awful lot of what they call in the markets linker bonds, right? Bear with me. All that means is the interest payment that you get on the bond when you lend the British government money goes up with the rate of inflation. And it goes up not by CPI, the Consumer Price Index,
Yeah.
which was up 3.6% during the year to June. It goes up by RPI, the retail price index, which was up 4.4% during the year to June. It's generally a high.
So because inflation in the UK is stubbornly persistent and rising,
Highest in the
that
G7, highest
that's
in the G7.
freaking out the markets who are saying, well, you've got a lot of inflation-linked debt going on here.
That's right. So
Yeah.
when you have inflation-linked debt, right, and you have high inflation, you have to borrow even more to pay the interest on your existing debt, because the
And that's the
existing
debt doom loop.
that is a big part that accelerates the debt doom loop. The debt doom loop would be there anyway, but that really accelerates it, and that's something that the markets are really concerned about. Now, just some more numbers. Ordinarily across the G7, the big advanced industrialized economies, they have like 5 to 10% of their debt is inflation linked, right? The highest is Italy, which is 12. The French are 10, the Germans, the Americans.
And Italy's a notorious basket
That's
case
right.
economically, right?
Italy is no, we almost sniff at the Italians,
Yeah.
right? We
Yeah.
sniff at the Italians
Yeah.
because they can't manage their fiscal policy, and they need endless bailouts and all the rest of it, right? So Italy has 12% of its GDP, of its debt, outstanding sovereign debt, is index linked. The UK, now the latest official figure is 27, and an official figure hasn't come out for a while, but mates of mine in financial markets, they ask around, they do surveys, and it's probably above 30 now.
Wow.
It's probably above 30.
Wow. Okay.
A complete outlier. A complete outlier. And
Yeah, it's worse than I thought it was, to be honest.
almost everyone at the top of the British government at this point in our discussion, Matt, I would say, my job is I talk to lots of senior politicians, as you know, in all the parties, and I detect zero understanding of pretty much everything I've said at the highest level of the British government at this point. And advisors who know a bit, not much, a lot of them are sort of 25, and they think they're a lot less clever than they think they are. They're not going to say this stuff to senior politicians, because no one wants to be the bearer of bad news. So they are the reasons why the markets are concerned about the British government's balance sheet.
I think I noticed when I saw the IMF statement. You and I are speaking here as we come up to the end of July 2025. When I saw the IMF statement about a few days ago, there was a very ominous line in it, and where the IMF said something like, we are beginning to become concerned about the fiscal constraints that are posing the UK state.
Nuclear language.
Yeah, and I noticed that in that
A
line, and I thought,
US-dominated organisation, nuclear language.
yeah,
I used to
and I
work.
thought, well, they're clearly teeing up,
Yeah.
this to go pretty dark. Now,
And it just 1 second, Matt. Sorry,
yeah,
it's not just the IMF. I used to work at the IMF. I know a fair bit about how the organisation works. That will have been through many committees, right?
yeah,
The
sure.
situation would be a lot worse than the language entails. But in the end, these organisations don't want to lose all credibility by not predicting massive stuff that happens. They don't.
So just on that,
The IMF, not just the IMF, right? The OBR itself, which is full of people, public sector economists, who, are not, unfriendly to Labour. These people
sure.
generally like Labour. Quite a few people at the OBR, have been advisors to the Labour government. They are now saying, right? They are now calling the UK's fiscal challenges daunting. You have a very clever guy who's near the top of the OBR. He's one of only 3 members of their Budget Responsibility Committee, which is the inner sanctum of the OBR, and he is now warning that if Labour keeps raising taxes, they are going to tank growth so much that the economy's ability to generate tax revenue will be even less than it currently is, and that will really freak out the market.
Can I just on that, because that's what I was going to ask you. So here we are, summer 2025, debt enormous, growth pretty much non-existent, taxes have already gone up, business confidence is collapsing, more millionaires, wealth creators, job creators are leaving the UK than any other advanced nation. We've got surveys that are showing that trend is going to pick up when the next round of data comes out. We've got what, 1 in 4 working age adults on some form of welfare benefit at the same time. And now everybody is braced for this budget. So we've got Rachel Reeves's big budget coming in the autumn. So I want to ask you two things. One is about the budget, and then I want to come on to Nigel Farage and reform. But let me ask you about the budget. There is a widespread expectation that Reeves is going to have to put taxes up. And whether that's self taxes, income tax rises, whatever, taxes will go up. How's the market going to react to that? That's obviously going to pile more pressure on businesses. They'll then raise their prices to reflect some of those taxes. In fact, we're already seeing today data as you and I are talking. I think food prices have gone up again as those national insurance tax rises are now working their way through the system. So talk us through the budget, what the market's expecting, and how maybe that can potentially usher in this crisis moment. And then after that, I want to come and talk about what we would do as a country to fix this enormous fiscal problem, and whether you think actually, given where the polling is, Nigel Farage and reform could do anything to fix this problem. But let's talk about the budget first. So tax is almost certainly going to go up. What impact is that going to have?
Well, ahead of this budget, as well as those warnings from the OBR, you also have, incredibly mainstream, respected people like Paul Johnson, right? Who is the outgoing
Institute for Fiscal Studies.
Yeah, he is the outgoing head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which here in the UK is a very highly respected, part quasi-public sector think tank. And he is saying, I'm literally in tears at the lack of reality ahead of this budget. He is now, I've known Paul Johnson for many, many years. As you can imagine, we're sort of economic nerds in common. We're roughly the same age. We went to similar and the same universities, as it were. He does not shoot from the hip, right? He is a very steady Eddie guy. He hasn't got a similar personality to you or me. We're much more kind of, outspoken people. And for him to be saying the things that he said, and I've written them up on my latest Substack post, is really quite astonishing. Because ahead of this budget, of course, you've got the mainstream commentators. They think in terms of, sort of matchstick economics. They don't really understand dynamic modelling. What do I mean by that? They think, there's a hole in the budget. You've got to increase taxes, and that will fill the hole. They don't understand, Matt, in the way financial markets do, that when you raise tax rates, you're now at the point where you're going to get less tax revenue because you hammer the private sector. And at the beginning of this discussion, we outlined some of the areas where you're seeing the private sector hammered by these tax rises. We've had negative growth in the UK for the last 2 months. Okay, the UK economy is flatlining and stagnating since those tax rises came in April. We've had negative growth in both April and May. And the danger now is that if Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, just has this knee-jerk response, there is a hole in the budget, I must raise taxes, because of course we're not even talking about cutting spending, we're talking about slow down the rate of growth of spending, right? We can come on to those welfare reforms, so-called. They're not going to do that because their backbenchers will go completely mental. And Reeves herself knows that, Angela Rayner, Big Ange, the Deputy Prime Minister, who increasingly is wearing the trousers in this Labour government, will just shoo her away. She'll just get rid of her. And she'll be a completely failed Chancellor. So she will do what the Labour backbenchers and Angela Rayner wants, which is to raise taxes. What the markets are worried about, and I've had many conversations with people who manage literally hundreds of millions, billions of pounds in sovereign wealth markets around the world. In my background as an asset manager, I know a lot of these people. They trust me. I've been an investor myself. I've been a market professional myself. And we swap information. I give them information that I can see about politics, nothing untoward. I just look and talk to people, and they give me information on what's going on in financial markets. And I would say that's a useful exchange. What they're really worried about, Matt, is that she's going to pull the higher tax rate lever, and she's going to get a lot less tax.
Yeah.
And then where do you go?
And she'll get a lot less tax, partly because a lot of folks will just simply get up and leave,
Yeah,
won't they?
that's the kind of, that's anecdotally, that's happening.
Well, the top, I
It's
think I'm
not
right in saying this, the
much bigger than
top
that. It's not
5%,
just
the
the
top,
wealthy leaving. It's not just the wealthy
yeah,
leaving.
yeah,
That's just a small symbolic thing. I mean, it's not small, but much, much more important with this rise in NIC for employers means those mum and pop businesses that run the British economy, that are 2/3 of our employment, that are a half our GDP, that drive our economy forward, that are hotbeds of innovation, they are not taking people on. They are laying people off.
yeah,
That is what is happening. That 25 billion annual rise in NIC tax has been absolutely devastating for
yeah.
the private sector. Plus the rise in capital gains tax, which means no one's selling anything because they don't want to crystallize the gains. Plus the ramping up of stamp duty, which means the housing market's completely dead. Nothing's moving for middle and higher priced houses. So the chain doesn't work with those transactions rippling down the economy. In each house sale that happens, you have massive economic activity, conveyancing, lawyering, accountants, DIY, furniture sales, everything. All that is gone because the housing market's dead. In so many areas, Labour is hammering the economy. And if
Yeah.
she goes for higher taxes, which she will, of course, because ideologically that's all she knows, and then she gets lower tax revenues, we've got a major problem.
Yeah, I was only going to add to the fact that we also have very visibly an anti-wealth mood setting into this country through the school fee changes, the non-dom changes, the potential of a wealth tax, which interestingly, people like Lord Kinnock have been advocating, but also some Labour ministers have been refusing to actually rule out. One stat, I think I might have read it on your Substack actually, top 5% of earners in this country pay half of all income tax in this country. Top 1% pay about a third of that.
Exactly
Now,
right.
look, not everybody's going to up sticks and leave, but I can tell you, Liam, in my cohort, most of my mates who are not into politics, they're working in construction, some of them are in the city, some of them are in sort of creative industries. A lot of those guys, somewhere between, let's say, early 30s, late 40s, are basically saying, why am I even paying all of this tax for this social contract? Because I'm getting broken borders, I've got high crime London, I've got a social contract that's basically imploding around me. Why don't I go to Dubai? Why don't I go to Italy? Why don't I just get up and leave? Now, obviously, as you say, this is a small part of the broader problem. But if the taxes go up, if Labour really gun hard on taxes, economic activity starts to grind to a halt. And this is why I've said, I'm happy to be wrong. I've said for the first time since Labour came to power, I'm actually not convinced Labour are going to get to the next general election because you could see a series of events that start to rapidly undermine public and market confidence in Rachel Reeves and by extension Keir Starmer. Maybe Labour decide, well, it's easier to start chopping off some heads, which undermines market confidence. Maybe you get some external intervention. The IMF or the market starts to say, you know what, this government can't even pass some pretty paltry welfare reforms. It's not going to get its arms around this issue. We're going to call time. I mean, is it plausible to think that maybe this thing spirals to an extent that Labour don't even end up getting to 28, 29?
It's certainly plausible, yes. When Labour won in early July 2024, I think you and I were among the very first people in the dead of night, in the middle of the results coming out, to say, crikey, they've won 33% of the vote on a 60% turnout. That means they've won only 20% of the electorate, right?
Yeah.
And yet they've got a massive majority because of the way our voting system works. I wrote that weekend that I reckon this will be a one-term Labour government. And that was at the time when people were, so much of the broadcast media, of course, were euphoric because Labour were in.
The adults were back.
They were all their mates were back in government. Crikey. But the idea was that Starmer was going to conquer all before him, and it was going to be Blair all over again. Of course, the majority was similar to Blair. So I've always understood, as I know you have, and you've written very authoritatively in this area since with your polling, I know, which I follow, that this Labour coalition, this Labour movement, support for it was broad but very, very shallow and very, very brittle, and that's what we're seeing now. And since then, of course, we've had reforms storming to the front of British opinion polls. So I can see that support for Labour is very, very low, and Starmer's personal ratings are very, very weak. But I struggle to see constitutionally, however much the public wants it, how to get Labour out before this the next, they call a general election, which they don't have to do for 5 years, so now 4 years, because we're just over a year into this Parliament. The only way it could really happen, given that they've got a 170 seat odd majority, a majority that's going to fall a lot. I mean, Reform now have got 4 to 6 MPs, depending on how you define it. Our viewers are pretty knowledgeable people; they'll know what I mean. I think by the next election, general election, Reform will have 10 to 15 MPs from by-elections and defections from the Tories. You may even start to see. I kid you not, I hesitate to wade deep into politics on your Substack, but I think you could even get 1 or 2 Labour MPs defecting to Reform. I genuinely do.
Well, we have people a lot on the show who are kind of disillusioned,
the sort of blue Labour types,
social democrats, etc.
Yeah.
Let's just talk then. Okay, so maybe there is a combination of events that rapidly undermine public confidence, market confidence.
It would have to be a vote of no confidence.
Yeah, so I was going to say, or either way, is if a lot of their own MPs become turkeys voting for Christmas. That's a very loaded political phrase, because it's the phrase that Jim Callaghan used when Labour were no confidence in 1979. Then it was the SNP, the Scottish National Party, who voted Labour out in the vote of no confidence, even though they knew that Labour were more disposed towards devolution than the Tories were. But let's say, okay, maybe they lose confidence, maybe they don't. According to all polling, according to all bookies, Farage is the next prime minister, or at least leader of the largest party. Therefore, will have the first stab at forming a government. He comes in. The note is left. It's not just there's no money left. You've also got this Everest pile of debt, which is very expensive, as you say, and UK PLC is basically spiraling and coming apart. What is the prognosis? I mean, what do you even do to start to get the economy back on track? Because Farage is basically saying, look, we need to ditch net zero, 800 billion, as we saw in the OBR report, 30 billion a year. We need to take on waste and fraud. The National Audit Office says last year that was between 50 and 85 billion in the state. Fix the borders, that could get you probably about 10 billion a year. Crack down on welfare. We're spending 12 billion a year on welfare for people who aren't even British. Maybe if we can leave the ECHR, control the borders, we'll save another 15 billion that's going to housing and private accommodation for illegal migrants. He also is talking about reducing taxation, particularly corporation tax, trying to get competitive advantage with the EU. Okay, so he comes in with this pretty radical mission, but as we saw with Liz Truss, the markets are not good at accepting and working with a radical alternative to the status quo. So where does a reformed government go with this in-tray, with this horrific, terrifying, doom-laden in-tray that's going to face them in the Treasury on day one?
You need to be really bold. And I think if a British government was really bold, and if the markets were prepared, and if there was an emerging coalition in favour of this, then I do think markets would give the British government, a new British government, with a mandate for genuine reform, the benefit of the doubt for long enough that we could avoid a major meltdown. But it's not going to come from, fiscal prudence isn't really going to be achieved by spending lots less and taxing lots more.
Yeah.
Fiscal prudence is going to be achieved by growth. They're the first 3 priorities for how to fix the public finances. And you are not going to fix the public finances when your tax burden, tax as a share of GDP, is at a 70-year high.
Yeah.
Which it was when Labour came in, by the way.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to go through this discussion without mentioning Labour's awful inheritance from the Tories. Yeah. Fair play to Labour. It was a 70-year high. But then you increase it even more if you keep increasing the tax burden, if you keep jacking up tax rates, you are going to kill growth, making it the economy even less capable of repaying even the interest on the debt. And that's when markets will spasm.
So what Trump said to Keir Starmer in Scotland, which is whoever starts getting serious about a tax cutting agenda is going to win the next general election.
Obviously, like you, Matt, a lot of people at the top of quite a few of the political parties ask me my views privately about things. I'm very happy to give my views to anyone serious who asks me. And some people on the Labour front bench even ring me up from time to time and ask me what I think about stuff. And I'm very happy to talk to them as a sort of, columnist and so on. What I would be doing, that my priorities would be a cut in corporation tax and a massive increase in the VAT threshold for sole traders and small businesses, up from 80 grand. Because, I come from a small business background. My dad came over from Ireland, started a tiny building company off the kitchen table, right? And most of my relatives, that's what they do. To this day. I'm not from a background where anyone went to university, maybe a bit like you. And that's why I do think I have a bit of a feel for how ordinary people and ordinary businesses are thinking and feeling as, and how they respond to public policy. At the moment, the VAT threshold is about 80, 85 grand. So what a lot of plumbers do, and even hairdressers, they basically stop working in February. Because if they go over the VAT threshold, then they're going to, most of it's going to go on tax. And so they don't do that. So I will jack up the VAT threshold. I reckon that would be a perfect Laffer curve. That is the idea that when you lower tax rates, you get more revenue. I reckon jacking up the VAT threshold instantly to 150 would lead to more tax revenue, a lot more economic activity. I would scrap stamp duty on housing, right? Yeah. Get the housing market going. So there's 3 big headline tax cuts. And then we can start talking, as I have been talking for a long time, and it's a policy that I know Reform have taken on. I would increase the starting rate of the personal tax threshold from 12.5 grand, where it currently is. It's been stuck there for ages. It's disgusting, this fiscal drag. 20 grand straight away with a view to moving it to 25. Get people moving. Get people off benefits. There are a lot of benefit scroungers out there, but there are an awful lot of people who are sitting in pubs thinking, you know what, I really want to be at work, but I'm not going to go to work because it's going to cost my family money if I go to work. So I'd be a lot more flexible in terms of the benefit taper, and I would get the starting rate of the threshold for personal income tax from 20 with a view to 25 grand in what is still a high inflation.
Can I just ask you as well, because just as we come towards the end, right? Say Reform should go bold, okay? Get big, go bold.
The Tories should be talking about these things too.
Sure. And Tories should say, yeah, absolutely. Anyone who wants to fix UK PLC, absolutely. But the one thing I would say though is, Liz Truss went bold, and nobody could handle it. The markets couldn't handle it. Westminster couldn't handle it. The media had a meltdown. Now, my theory has been, if the polls are right, and there's good reason to think they are, they've got a pretty okay track record at general elections. If Nigel Farage does end up as the leader of the largest party, and everybody knows there's going to be a very radical change of direction, how is he going to reassure the markets and the political class, the media class, not to have a comparable meltdown to the one they had when Liz Truss came in?
The first thing is political, right? I want the Tories and Reform to be saying roughly the same thing, not only because I think it's the right thing, because I believe if the Tories and Reform are irrevocably split, I know as well as you do how Nigel feels about the Tory party, the fact they didn't thank him after 2019 when he handed them Downing Street, the way they've treated him, all of that. I know that personal pain that he feels, and I also, don't know how Kemi feels about Reform, because she feels that this bloke's trying to destroy, the most successful political party in the world. So we need the centre right of British politics to at least demonstrate that it's going to work together, right? Because these political parlour games that they're playing now are costing us serious money with the markets. It is a question of responsibility. Politics is a zero-sum game, right? I only gain if you lose, right? business isn't a zero-sum game. We don't like each other, Matt, but let's do a deal because it's better for both of us and both our balance sheets will look better, right? This is business now. They have to do some kind of deal. Yes, they need to contest the election. Of course they do. But there has to be indications that when it comes to it, they are going to do a deal, right? To keep Labour out.
So let's say we have a kind of confident supply type
keep
arrangement where you have a Kemi Badenoch or a Robert Jenrick or whoever saying, look, we're going to support the parts of the Reform Manifesto that we think are consistent with Conservative principles. The question, though, just lastly, is this. So that's the Tory party. You need some kind of, I mean, obviously Nigel would say, well, if I win a majority, I don't need any Tories, but there we are. But in terms of the markets, how the markets react, when do they price in the possibility of a reform government? And when do they, basically, pardon my French here, but when do they lose their shit when the prospect of a reform government comes into focus? Because I imagine, this is going to be a shock. I mean, if you look at, we saw how the markets in France were reacting at the prospect of, Marine Le Pen becoming president of France. I mean, I'm more interested in the market perspective on this.
Okay.
And do reform need to start, preparing people, when does the Blair version of, what was it, the cocktail party strategy, does reform need to do that? The
prawn cocktail strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, the prawn cocktail. Sorry. Well, I'm sure with Nigel it will involve cocktails.
Look, just before I get to that, I know it comes to the end. I just got to say about October 2022, right?
Yeah.
I think what that demonstrated wasn't that financial markets aren't interested in growth, and Liz Truss was going for growth, right? But it wasn't what she did. It was the way she did it, and also there were other things going on. Just let me say it briefly, Max. I think it's very, very important to get this stuff into the political mainstream. She should not have flown blind. She should not have excluded the OBR and the Bank of England from her plans, right? I know why she did it, because she was really upset, because she felt that lots of people in the Treasury insulted her when she was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, and they did, right? But she should not have done that. That was mad, with respect to her. And I've got a lot of respect for her and her resilience, and I think a lot of her ideas are roughly right. But she should not have messed with British institutions like that. It's the sixth biggest economy in the world, right? You cannot just say, I'm not going to tell the OBR and I'm not going to tell the Bank of England about my budget. That should not have happened. She should have rolled the pitch, not just with the markets, but also with, the institutions of the UK. So at least they gave her a fair hearing. The second thing, though, wasn't her fault. The second thing was the combination of the so-called liability-driven investments, which meant that lots of leverage in the markets unwound. That's been written about. But what hasn't been written about, and very, very few of us have had the guts to talk about this, is at the very, just ahead of the mini budget, perhaps even in retaliation, because she'd kept the Bank of England in the dark about her budget, the Bank of England started selling millions of pounds of bonds into the market, right? So-called quantitative tightening. They did not have to start their quantitative tightening then, right? But they announced that they were going to do all this selling. The selling didn't actually start, but just announcing that they were going to flood financial markets with more government bonds that they'd bought during COVID for various reasons, which we can explain. The timing of that by the Bank of England, right, was at the very least unfortunate, right?
Yeah.
And I think future historians may say, and there should be an inquiry, future historians may say it was aggressive by the Bank of England to try and rein in Liz Truss and her mad right-wing ideas. Her actual ideas weren't mad and right-wing. She wanted to lower the top rate of income tax to 45, which is where it spent most of the Blair period. Right? That wasn't mad. She had to show support for energy prices because of the war in Ukraine. In the end, most of that money ended up not being spent. And it's completely right, in my view, to keep corporation tax at 19. She wasn't lowering corporation tax. She was keeping it where it was. It wasn't it was how she did it. And the tragedy is that, people just say Liz Truss and roll their eyes.
Yeah.
And most journalists and most people in the political Westminster media village then think, oh yeah, we can't do anything like that. We can, but we have to do it in
Absolutely.
a professional way, with both the Tories and Reform indicating, right, within the realms of a contested election, which there should be, but indicating that they've got roughly the same ideas. And of course, they will be the ones that form the coalition.
Indeed.
And that is the way to stop a major crisis. And
absolutely.
It's in our hands.
And that is taking us to the hour, Liam. So we have to stop it there, but we've covered an enormous amount of ground. And the last thing I would say is, I think that is indeed one of the reasons why you often see Nigel Farage talking with people who were in and around the Liz Truss premiership, including, of course, Kwasi Kwarteng, about the process and the sequencing that went on there. And we've covered pretty much everything we needed to cover. Why the lights on the dashboard are flashing red. We've talked about the looming financial crisis. We've talked about the failure of the mainstream media to actually understand what's going on in the economy. We've talked about Farage and reform. And the thing I suspect, Liam, especially given your work on when the facts change, your Substack, I have a funny feeling this is the beginning of a longer conversation about the state of the economy as we go through towards that budget in the autumn, because politics, the political crisis that we spend a lot of our time talking about, linked to mass uncontrolled immigration, linked to the social fabric, is now becoming so enmeshed and linked with this deteriorating economic environment that I think we need to make a lot more sense as to how these are interacting and where they're leading us. We've also, by the way, been doing a bit more work recently on the energy side of things, on net zero, because I think the fact we're dealing also with the highest energy prices in the world has a lot to do with our growth story too. Thank you to Liam Halligan. Thank you to all of your commentary and insight, and of course everybody can check out Liam at When the Facts Change, also at the Telegraph, Planet Normal, etc. We will be sharing this on Wednesday. A short clip will go out to our free subscribers. Obviously, paying supporters get absolutely everything up front, and then way down the track, we'll also potentially share it on YouTube as well. But as always, our most active supporters get everything first because they make our work possible and they help us try and spread the word among millions of others. So, Liam, thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. See you soon. Thank you.